Is this the year? Is this the year that Lance Stroll finally leaves the F1 grid? Welcome back, Sebastian here, and today I'm going to be discussing 8 drivers who could leave the F1 grid in 2026. And so for the 8 drivers I've decided to discuss today, I'm going to put them in descending order from least likely to leave the F1 grid to, in my opinion, most likely to leave the F1 grid. Of course, it's very early in 2026. It's still the middle of April. Still a little bit early to be discussing silly season, making predictions of rookies who could be joining the grid, and also making concrete, predictions of who could be moving where, or that kind of thing. But I do think we're at a point in the season where I can kind of discuss drivers who possibly be leaving F1 at the end of this season. And we do have quite a few drivers here. Definitely not all of them will leave. I think probably the number is going to be about 3 to 4 maybe. 4 might be a bit high, but I can definitely see quite a few of these drivers leaving. In past years when I've done this video, I've often framed it from the perspective of drivers who are kind of under pressure, drivers who are at risk of basically being fired. But I think this year we do have at least 2 drivers who I think are performing very, very well and who could leave F1. So that kind of framing doesn't really work, which is why I've decided to change it a little bit for this year. Now, number 1, first driver that we're going to be discussing today is none other than Lewis Hamilton. Now, if we had done this video at the start of 2020, or at the end of 2025, I should say, before the season started, I think Hamilton would actually be quite a bit higher on this list. He's 41 years of age, so of course he is getting up there in age, second oldest driver on the grid after Fernando Alonso, and he was coming off a pretty poor 2025 season, and he looked so mentally down, so mentally out of it when we finished last year. But this year has been much better. He's been a bit closer to Leclerc in both race pace, qualifying pace. Right now, his qualifying head-to-head is 1-2, so he's gotten 1 qualifying win compared to 2 losses, with an average qualifying gap of about 1/10 of a second, which is a little bit closer than last year. Points is also very, very close, 41 for Hamilton, 49 for Leclerc, and he is performing a little bit better. The Ferrari's a little bit stronger of a car compared to last year as well. So those are all things that are all kind of pushing in the direction of Hamilton probably staying for another year. But you never know. He is still quite old by F1 standards. And even if Ferrari are kind of like a front-running car, he may still decide that he wants to call it a day at the end of the year for whatever reason. But I do think he's definitely towards the lower end of the list in terms of likelihood of leaving F1 at the end of this season. Okay, number 7, we're going to go with Nico Hülkenberg. So for Hülkenberg, 38 years of age, he's been in F1 for quite a while now, and of course I think in some ways his comeback, having that kind of sabbatical break from 2019 till basically 2023 where he wasn't really on the grid, having that sabbatical I think actually probably elongated his F1 career. So far this season, the qualifying head-to-head is 1 win for him, 2 defeats, with a median qualifying gap of technically being ahead by 0.04 of a second, courtesy of, I think, out-qualifying Bortoleto by 0.6 in China. But again, so early, and these numbers don't really mean a whole lot. In terms of points, no points so far this year, and 2 for his teammate Bortoleto. I do think that there's a little bit more pressure on Hülkenberg if the qualifying results aren't quite there, if results are kind of not there in the races either, which is one of the big differentiating factors between himself and Bortoleto. Last year, Hülkenberg was much better at picking up points in races. Or I could see a situation where Hülkenberg is kind of maybe pushed out the door by Audi if they want to bring in another experienced driver, or if they want to bring in another rookie. So that's why I'm putting him a little bit ahead of Hamilton on this list. They are in very similar situations, but I do think for Hamilton, Behrman is right there, and Behrman could put a lot of pressure on Ferrari to do something if Hamilton's results kind of take a trend closer towards where they were last year. But for Hülkenberg, there isn't really anyone who's kind of come up in rumors as someone who's really vying for that Audi seat, but that could change very, very quickly. So I'm going to put Hülkenberg in 7th. All right, next, I'm going to go with Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, like I said, is this finally the year that Stroll leaves F1? I don't know. The fact I have him 6 out of 8 drivers on this list, I'm going in order of increasing likelihood to leave the grid. For me, I think it's still a good chance that he's on the grid next year in 2027. He's 27 years of age, qualifying head-to-head against Alonso this year, 0-2, median qualifying gap, well, it's only 2, so the average is the same. It's about half a second, so not very good in qualifying. Stroll has definitely not gotten the most out of the car in qualifying, and if anything, his deficit has actually increased against Alonso. No points either. The car has been abysmal. That's not really Stroll's fault, but it is something that perhaps, especially with his recent GT3 race outing this past weekend in France, potentially could Stroll get moved over to the GT car portion of Aston Martin so that they could have a potentially all-new driver line. Maybe a bit of a hint to someone else who's a little bit later in this video. But that being said, I do think at this point, as long as the car is not a front-running car, I think really the decision is going to be in Lance's hand as to whether or not he stays on the F1 grid. If he decides he wants to keep staying or stick around, keep racing what's probably going to be not a very good Honda Aston Martin car next year, he can do that. If he decides this is enough, he doesn't want to get shaken to death every single weekend, he could leave the grid if he so chose. But yeah, I don't think with Aston Martin's current situation, I don't think there's going to be a ton of pressure from other drivers wanting to join Aston Martin, given how poor the situation is there. So that's why Stroll's ultimately a little bit higher on the list. But the fact that he started doing GT racing, stuff like that, can actually, signal that he may be interested in doing other things outside of F1. Number 5, I'm going to go with Liam Lawson. Now, Lawson might be a bit of an odd choice. He's had a pretty decent start of the season in some metrics, and other metrics not so much. But for Lawson, 24 years of age, he's actually winning qualifying head-to-head over his rookie teammate Arvid Lindblad 2-1, and the average gap is about 0.3 of a second, but that's skewed heavily by the first qualifying session that they did together, where Lawson out-qualified Lindblad by about a second. That was a weekend where Lindblad looked the quicker of the two drivers in qualifying, and so from the 3 qualifying sessions we've had, Lindblad has looked quicker in 2 of them, but Lawson was definitely the better of the 2 in China. In terms of points, also looks pretty good for Lawson, 10 points for him, 4 for his teammate Lindblad, so he is definitely starting on a much better footing compared to last year. But he is in Red Bull. The fact that he's already been promoted to Red Bull and then demoted back to Racing Bulls does kind of mean that at this point he is kind of expendable. His situation may depend heavily on a certain driver who's in the main Red Bull team, and Red Bull deciding to go from there. Red Bull does have a pretty decent junior in Nicholas Olive in Formula 2 this year, and that could, if he has a really strong season, that could definitely put pressure on Lawson in his F1 seat, as highly likely they would not get rid of Lindblad after one season, even if Lawson would have beat him on the points head-to-head. And this is a situation that, Racing Bulls has found themselves in the past, about, 12 years ago now, with Jean-Eric Vergne. Vergne was ultimately, in terms of one lap pace, slower than his rookie teammate Kvyat, but he did beat his teammate pretty handedly in terms of points finishes, points results, and despite that, he still got kicked out at the end of the year. Of course, Helmut Marko is no longer involved in Red Bull. There's a very good chance that they'll be a lot less trigger happy than they've been for the past 20 years or so. But it will be interesting to see for Lawson. I do think that there's a bit of pressure on him given his qualifying results. Honestly, the best thing I think for Lawson would be keep his head down, keep getting good race finishes, and there's a chance he may be able to pick up a seat outside of the Red Bull family for next season. I know Red Bull has generally been pretty strict on their 5-year contracts, but you never know, that final year can get bought out if someone was really interested in his services. Now, number 4, I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, a bit of an up and down start to the season, mostly down, I would say. He's 29 years of age. This is his second full season with Haas. I believe his eighth full season F1, I should say. In terms of results, last year or so, with Haas, they haven't been so good. He's generally been outshone by his younger, less experienced teammate, Oliver Bearman. This year, to start qualifying, it's 1-2 in terms of qualifying, with a median qualifying, or an average qualifying gap, I should say, of about just over a tenth of a second. Race results also not very good. Ocon only on 1 point so far this year. Bearman on 17. So I do think that there's going to be a bit of pressure on Ocon. I do think that there's been, quite publicly, the team has not been super impressed with his results. They expected him to be a lot more consistent, and during his time at the team, he's been very consistently inconsistent, and that's not really what you want from someone who's supposed to be an experienced team leader. There's also Ferrari juniors who may be looking at that seat, Rafa Kamara, for example, and especially if Behrman has to stay another year because Ferrari decides to keep Hamilton, that could put a lot of extra pressure on Ocon to retain that seat. And so I do think that he is a little bit more at risk for losing his seat for 2027. So I would say the top 4 drivers, real possibility they could lose their seats. 4 drivers I talked about before, so from basically Lawson up, I do think those drivers are a little bit more on the less likely at this point, but you never know. Okay, now moving on to number 3. Number 3 is obviously one that's been in the headlines a little bit the last three weeks or so since the Japanese Grand Prix and some comments that this driver made, and that is, of course, none other than Max Verstappen. For Verstappen, I think this is, again, very much a situation that's entirely in his control. If Verstappen wants to keep racing in F1, he will keep racing in F1. Could be at Red Bull, that could be elsewhere. It's been very heavily reported that he has a break clause in his contract where if at the summer break, if he's not in the top 2 in the Drivers' Championship, he is able to basically go to another team or just simply leave F1 and take a sabbatical or retire. And so it does seem at this point, given that Verstappen's general unhappiness is not necessarily with Red Bull itself and more with the regulations, it is looking more likely that that would be, trending towards a sabbatical. Now, in terms of results this year, not amazing. Qualifying result so far head-to-head against his less experienced teammate Hadjar, 1-1 with a average qualifying deficit, I should say. I usually use median, but for this video, because the sample sizes are so small, I went with average. The average qualifying gap to Hadjar is actually positive 0.02 seconds. So he's actually technically being out-qualified by his teammate, just his teammate had a bigger margin over him compared to the margin he had over Hadjar in those 2 qualifying head-to-heads. On points, generally it's been very good. 12 points for Verstappen compared to 4 for Hadjar. I think in terms of race results, Verstappen's been very, very good. I think it's been more on the qualifying side, maybe starts as well, where there's been some issues. But for Verstappen, of course, I do think at this point it's not necessarily definitely he's going to leave F1, but I would say that it's definitely in the realm of very possible, likely even. And so for Verstappen, he's definitely one of the drivers who I'd say is pretty good chance that he could potentially leave F1 at the end of the season, which I do think from a marketing PR perspective would be a pretty big blow for F1 for the new regulations. F1 has survived stars, suddenly leaving the sport in the past, but still it's generally under these specific circumstances with a driver about this young, relatively speaking, would not be a good look for F1. Now, number 2, I think similar situation to Verstappen in many ways, but in other ways not. And that is Fernando Alonso. So for Alonso, oldest driver on the grid, he's 44 years of age right now. He's turning 45 in July, I believe, which means that next year he would turn 46 mid-season. And at some point, Alonso has to look at his age, where he is, and also where the Aston Martin Honda project is. He's been driving, I think, very, very well this season. So far, he's out-qualified Stroll 2-0, median qualifying gap of half a second. So, again, seems like he's getting the most out of the car. Of course, no points, but the car is absolutely abysmal. And, of course, for Alonso, he'll be getting a pretty big sense of deja vu, as this is his second go-around with a very poor Honda engine. And I think given what we saw last time, it basically took them 4 years or so to get the engine back into a good spot. If you look at from 2014, 2015, 2016, honestly, the engine wasn't terrible, but then 2017 it was a disaster again, and then 2018 with Toro Rosso was again back into pretty good, and a lot more, a lot closer to the rest of the engine. So if we're looking at, let's say, a three-year period of Honda having to catch up on the engine side, even a 2-year period, that would basically take Alonso into his late 40s, at which point he's realistically not going to be competitive. He's not going to be able to compete for a championship. So does he want to stick around for an extended period of, poor performance? My guess is probably not. And so I think for Alonso, given Aston Martin's struggles, given Honda's struggles as well, I think a pretty good chance Alonso could just decide to walk away from the sport at the end of 2026. Of course, there is a possibility that if someone else wanted to pick him up, he might decide to go there. But I think realistically he would only do that for a front-running seat, a front-running opportunity, and I don't know how likely that is going to happen. You never know, perhaps if Verstappen leaves Red Bull and Red Bull needs an experienced driver, Alonso would go there, as it would definitely be an upgrade over where Aston Martin is right now. But again, that's something that would be very, very strange to see. But that's something for a silly season type video. Now, getting on to number one last driver we're going to talk about, and in my opinion, the driver most likely to leave the F1 grid after this season is none other than Franco Colapinto. So for Colapinto, this one is definitely one that's almost entirely performance-based. So for Colapinto, 22 years of age, so far this season the results have not been great. 0-3 in qualifying, a median qualifying gap of about 0.6 of a second. That's much too big, much even bigger than Alonso and Stroll. And in terms of points, also pretty poor. 1 point so far for Colapinto compared to 15 for his teammate Gasly. I do admit he was a little bit unlucky to only get that 1 point in China. Probably should have ended up with maybe 1 or 3 more, but still for Colapinto, he needs to start creating his own luck, creating his own opportunities, and even though he does, contribute to the team financially through his sponsors, that's only going to get you so far. And so I think, especially given expectations were relatively high on Colapinto when he joined Alpine last season, I do think that if these struggles continue, especially in qualifying, I do think that likely Alpine will be looking at alternatives for 2027, especially given that the car is in a pretty good spot, and maybe 2027 they make the jump to being at least in touching distance with the front of the grid, in which case there's going to be a lot of drivers who are going to be wanting to go there, as it will be a much more attractive option than it was even last year, or Aston Martin or Williams this year. So there you go. Those are 8 drivers who I feel could leave the F1 grid at the end of the season. I guess if I were to give an honorable mention, I was just looking through the grid and looking at the results so far this year. For potentially even a 9th driver, I would say Albon. But I think Albon's done enough at Williams, enough goodwill there. Had a very good season last year. I think he will definitely almost certainly be safe for at least 1 more year, even if Sainz is convincingly the stronger of the 2 at Williams. So I stuck with the 8 drivers here. Curious to know how many of these drivers you think will leave the F1 grid this year, or how many stay longer into 2027. So that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.